Hello, everyone, and welcome to Confrontational Histories, the YouTube channel that confronts bad historical myths and narratives. Today, being close to the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, we're going to be talking about a figure in American history who is himself the living embodiment of a myth, Robert E. Lee. Now, if you have even the most casual interest in American history, or you grew up in America, Lee is almost inescapable as a figure in American history. He's often presented to us as the embodiment of a great American general. Oftentimes, he is called the greatest American general of all time. And he's also seen as something of the beau ideal of these antebellum Southern values and of great qualities like honor and concern for his men in a cause, and as sort of a stern and stoic figure who is immortalized in marble and admired from afar. The cult of Lee, you could call it, was very much alive during the Civil War itself and continued well after his death, as perpetuated by a lot of lost cause myths, many of which are still with us today and serve to magnify his greatness and his mythical status within the American pantheon. But is Lee worth the hype? Well, that's going to be the topic of this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Let's get on with it. Now, like a lot of young men who take up an interest in American history, the Civil War is my first love. I would spend hours upon end memorizing the battles and all of the great feats that were done, what units were involved, the entire command structures of the armies, who did what when, all the gods and general stuff, etc., etc., etc. I used to be able to quote almost the entirety of the movie Gettysburg by heart. And then, like a lot of people, when I started to adopt a deeper understanding of history and got more interested in broader trends in industrial and social history, I started to drift away from the Civil War. Started to learn about World War I and World War II and study those wars instead. But then I came back to the Civil War with a more thorough appreciation of the war as a social event, as an industrial event, as an economic event, studying it as I would study other modern wars, because the Civil War was in every single aspect a modern war, even if modern weapons and tactics had not yet been developed. And then from there, I started to get more interested again in the experiences of the battles, but more from, the perspective of the average soldier. And then from that point, you start to reevaluate a lot of these great historical figures, but you see them less as the statues, less as the people immortalized in marble, less as the myths, and more from a more critical standpoint. You see the flaws and you start to question, well, they may have had a genius maneuver in this one battle, but was their entire decision-making process? You start to question whether the things that they did were necessary, beyond the grand maneuvers. Were there better ways that they could have handled the situations that they were in? And you start to gain a bit more insight into their characters. And that's very much the case with Lee. And I know that it's a bit cheating and dogpiling to release this video on the anniversary of Lee's greatest mistake and disaster. That kind of sets a tone for the video that is somewhat helpful to the critical approach I'm going to take. And I also know that, my stance in this video is not original. Atun Shea Films has done more critical looks of Confederate leadership and of Lee in particular. And more recent scholarship that's liberated from lost cause mythology has started to take a more critical look of Lee. And so I know those videos are out there, but just like with my other videos, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective and talk about some of the aspects that those videos did not talk about. And so part of this video is going to include what you might call original research. I'm not going too far out of bounds here, however, and it's original research that I feel is strongly backed by actual hard substantive facts. And I'm going to avoid topics such as what a harsh and brutal slave master Lee was, in contrast to the genteel image that is built up of him, because again, other videos have covered that. It's out there. It's a thing. I'm not saying don't acknowledge it. I'm saying go to those other videos because they already covered it. So to start, what is the lost cause myth, and what was Lee's place in all of this, since this is essentially the largest myth I'm going to be combating in this video? Well, the most basic version of the lost cause myth is that the South nobly fought a doom struggle against the North as a last stand for antebellum, chivalric, pure and innocent social values against the rising tide of industrialism, and that the South was eventually crushed in this effort after a brave struggle. Lee is seen as the embodiment of the ideals of the antebellum South and as a representative of these old benign patrician values, and as someone who then nobly put down his sword and tried to mend the country back together when it was all over. Slavery's prominence in all of this kind of depends on the acceptability of overt racism at any given time, at least in terms of where it features in the narrative. The lost cause sort of rose in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was an immediate attempt to try to rewrite the justifications of the war, and the original prophet of this was Jubal Early, but it carries through to far more contemporary figures to our time, such as Shelby Foote. The lost cause then became a predominant way of teaching history about the Civil War and about the antebellum South and about Reconstruction, really throughout the entirety of American history from the Civil War on to the 1990s when it started to unravel. If you're going to take a look and evaluate Lee's generalship, the first thing that you have to do is evaluate the overall strategic situation that the South was in and compare the actual reality to the perceived reality of a number of Southern leaders. Now, if you study the Civil War, you're going to hear about this notion that the Confederacy was an underdog and that the North had a bunch of overwhelming advantages in manpower, in economy, in industry, in infrastructure. And while this notion of the South as an underdog, it certainly is quite understandable when you're looking at all of these advantages and taking them at face value that the North had. A couple of things that I think that are worth bearing in mind. First of all, is that the poor infrastructure of the South was as much of a hindrance to the Northern troops advancing, if not more of a hindrance than it was to the South in terms of moving men and moving goods around. And when you're looking at the advances of the Union Army during this period, you have to remember that they had to occupy all of the territory that they were taking. And they needed to be able to move supplies. They needed to be able to move their men around through the same territory that the South was fighting through. If you recall back in episode 2 when I was talking about the Second World War and Eisenhower's broad front strategy, I made the point that the broad front was needed to protect Allied supply routes from being cut off or being overextended. This type of broad front strategy just really wasn't as possible during the American Civil War for the Union, because the Union Army didn't have the same manpower and did not have the same mechanization in their forces, obviously, as the Allied forces had during the Second World War. Now, you don't quite get that impression when you're looking at maps of the dispositions of the armies during the war. It makes it look like it's always a broad unified front. But this isn't really accurate. The Union had to maintain some fairly long supply lines, but even while doing this, they were still doing their best to advance in sort of a roughly uniform way that protected the supply routes while they were moving. Obviously, protecting supply routes in this way drained a lot of manpower from the North. They needed units to guard the supply routes as they advanced forward. And so across the vast expanse of North America, the Union never was able to bring its entire full manpower to bear against the Confederates. And so these manpower advantages are a little misleading at times. So keeping that in mind, an argument I've made a lot of times when I've been discussing this with friends or with folks online is that, in my opinion, when you're looking at the strategic situation in North America as it was, when you're looking at where the choke points were, where you had a lot of wide open terrain that favored a lot of movement, the Confederacy kind of fought the war all stupid. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the one place where you could actually hold and maintain a fairly unified front was in Virginia. I'm going to show a map here. If you look at this, you can see that I have outlined this area on the map in green. This green zone here is sort of the area of optimal operation for any Union armies. And so why is it the area of optimal operation? Well, because you can see on the map in black, I have drawn up roughly where the rail lines went. The Union armies advancing needed access either to the rail lines or to ocean ports or river ports, as is often the case, or both, in order to be able to maintain any supply line that they had. Now, there's a yellow zone there that you can see that I've kind of shown as a less optimal area where smaller Union forces could still operate. The rail lines are a little sparser. You would need a lot of soldiers to be able to guard and maintain them, but you could operate sort of a smaller force in those areas, but not a large army, because you need both these river ports, which were supplying the Union Army well up through the entirety of the Overland Campaign, and before that. And then you also need good road access and good rail access in order to be able to move men and supplies around. Now, the U.S. routes that you see on this map are actually pretty close to where the major roads were back during this time period. And all of this concentrates pretty much in a very narrow corridor, which at some points is no more than 25 miles long, directly north-south between Washington, and it goes through Richmond, Virginia, and then into Petersburg. This area has all kinds of obstacles for an advancing army. There are many rivers that cut through it. There are a number of heavily wooded areas like the wilderness. And then as you start to go out more toward the west, you have, as I said, sparser rail lines, sparser road connections, but you also get much more broken terrain. There are a lot more hills, and that makes it easier to surprise and defend, and therefore not as optimal for an offensive operation. That's why the Union Army basically did not go through there for the entirety of the war. However, this is where the Confederate forces decided to fight their wide open war of maneuver, or at least try to. They were always focused on capturing Washington, or winning a major battle outside of Washington that would cause Washington's forces to crumble, or move north. As you can see, I've set this sort of Shenandoah Valley corridor labeled here as well in red. But if you're thinking about this situation practically, if you have a firm strategic grasp, Washington was lined with forts. And this corridor here is incredibly easily defensible by even a fairly competent Confederate general, as long as you weren't as concerned about the Union trying to conduct a broad sweeping movement towards the west, towards Culpeper and towards Charlottesville, which they weren't going to do anyway because of the logistical concerns that were involved with such a maneuver. Then we're going to pull up another map here. If you look at the west, in this sort of brownish beige color, I have outlined the optimal theater of maneuver for the Confederate Army, basically the area where they had wide range to be able to conduct raids and small offensive operations. And then the two rivers that I have outlined here were the major supply routes for the Union Army throughout the entirety of the war. And instead of trying to fight a defense in depth here or to try offensive operations, although there was a major offensive operation into Kentucky in 1862 that was not successful, though it did cause quite a scare in the Union Army. Here, instead, the Confederates attempted to fight a static war without defense in depth. And there's no reason to fight a static war along these corridors if you are willing to duck and move and jive and conduct hit and run strikes and things like that. But always for the Confederates, they were fighting a static war in the West, and they were trying to fight their wide open war of maneuver in the East. Now, this setup is not necessarily Lee's fault entirely. This was sort of the entirety of the Confederate strategic brain trust who were responsible for this paradigm and for this mindset. They kind of all thought this way. One person who actually did understand the importance of the Western Front and continually tried to get his forces reassigned out to the Western Front because he understood that the Eastern Front would be easily defensible by an even marginally competent command and by fewer troops was James Longstreet. Longstreet was finally sent out after Gettysburg and participated in some operations out there, but by then it was too late. The Union Army already had way too tight of a foothold in Tennessee by that time. Now, even with that, the Union Army was almost cut off and surrounded and besieged and forced to surrender in Chattanooga, and they only were saved because Grant came out and was able to whip things into shape, and they were able to dislodge the Confederate forces. But for the most part, Tennessee had already been lost by this point. And of course, the Mississippi River had already been lost as well because of Vicksburg. And, this is a minor point to touch on, but I think it's important. The fall of Vicksburg wasn't important because it, quote, cut the Confederacy in half. By this point in the war, Louisiana, New Orleans had already been taken. Baton Rouge had already been taken. All of the major Louisiana ports were already in the hands of the Union Army. And Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas, their contribution to the overall Southern war effort was pretty minimal at this point. The reason the fall of Vicksburg was important was because it now allowed supplies from Pittsburgh and from St. Louis and from Chicago to go all the way down the Mississippi River and then make it all the way over to the east. And this cut the transportation costs for the Union Army significantly because most of the major cannon foundries were located in Pittsburgh, and in other areas along the Ohio Valley, that's where a lot of the factories were located, and shipping that stuff by rail over the mountains was very expensive. I mean, the Civil War, we think of it as being a railroad war, and of course it was the first time that railroads were used in this sort of mass capacity, but railroads were still expensive. Most things were still shipped by water. And so that's why these water routes that I had detailed and also these river ports in Virginia were so important to federal supply operations. As I'd said, though, not all Lee's fault. But what was Lee's fault? Well, early in 1862, Lee was obsessed with maintaining this threat against Washington. That's why he stationed his troops around Manassas and Culpeper. And Lee believed that by maintaining this threat on Washington, not only would he be able to perhaps win a decisive battle that would allow his forces to move on Washington, which, as I said, was an impossibility. Washington was far too heavily fortified from the south. And from the north, you run into other complications that I'll discuss once we get to Antietam and Gettysburg. But by holding his force here, he also put his men into a position where they could be possibly surrounded, possibly cut off, and he would constantly have to move around in order to ensure that his forces were not separated and were not cut off. And far from allowing his forces to concentrate, this actually spread the Confederate Army out unnecessarily. Now, when the battle for Second Bull Run, occurred, that was a major victory for Lee, but it was a major victory that came at a major cost for his own army. And it was kind of at that point that the South finally had to concede that this Northern Virginia position was not tenable. But then Lee had the idea of taking the battle north, moving through the Shenandoah and Cumberland valleys and possibly threatening Harrisburg or Philadelphia or Washington or Baltimore from the north. This is pretty flawed as an idea. And I'm not just saying this because the two major attempts ended poorly for the South, although the first time it only ended poorly because a copy of Lee's orders fell into Union hands and they were able to utilize that, so although somewhat ineffectively because of McClellan's hesitancy. But it's also flawed because when the South moved north, first they lost two of the biggest advantages that they had. Advantage number one was that the South always had this large enslaved and sometimes civilian workforce that could do things for them, like build entrenchments and scout and things like that. The enslaved people didn't scout. They were mostly building entrenchments and handling logistics and things like that. But the civilian force is able to scout for them and do other things. So anytime you look at the manpower and the statistics for any battle that happened on Southern soil, something that you have to bear in mind is that the South had force multipliers that are not showing up in their numbers of actual soldiers, because they have all of these civilians and enslaved folks who are augmenting their numbers by filling out certain support roles. Whereas in the Union Army, 5 to 10% of their force always had to conduct these support roles when they were conducting operations in the South. They had to be the medics, they had to be the wagon drivers, they had to do various other tasks. And so as in a modern army, that can be up to 50% of the entirety of your force. But it was about 5 to 10% in a Civil War army. But then the other major advantage that they lose is that they no longer get to pick where the battle happens. As I said, there were civilian scouts and people like that, but when you move north, you lose the ability to decide where an engagement is going to be fought, because you're at the whims of what the Union Army is doing, because they are now on the defensive. They get to decide where their positions are. And because you can't just directly assault Washington because of the forts I had mentioned before, you have to take the Shenandoah Valley, Cumberland Valley route. And there are only so many places where that comes out, where you have these gaps in the hills. The same hills that are defending you are also trapping you in. And so moving to the west isn't practical because there are more mountains that way. There are more geographic obstacles. So that's not really a realistic option. You have to come out east somewhere. And if you do that, then there are only so many places where you can do that. And so the Union Army can station scouts or picket forces or whatever, basically in a few select points where they know that you will have to come out of. And so that's pretty predictable. It takes away a lot of the unpredictability that a lot of folks will say that Lee relied on for his initial battles during this time period. And then, of course, also, unless you capture a major Union supply depot, like, say, Camp Curtin near Harrisburg, you are extremely limited in terms of your logistical capability to carry on multiple battles. You're kind of one and done after there's a major engagement. And so because of the general lack of mobility along this front, and because of the geographical concerns that are involved with trying to invade the North as Lee did, this is a very bad place to fight your wide open war of maneuver. But nonetheless, Lee was committed to this strategy, and it often left his forces completely spread out. And so if you're looking, there's a pattern here that forms in all of the battles of 1862 and then going into 1863. So at the Battle of Second Bull Run, Second Manassas, Lee was caught completely out of position by the Federal Army, but then infighting within the Federal ranks caused them to amass more slowly than they should have, and the Confederates were able to exploit that and earn a victory. At Fredericksburg, Lee was again caught completely out of position, but infighting within the ranks of the Federal Army allowed the Southern armies to come together and earn a victory. At Chancellorsville, the Army of Northern Virginia was again caught out of position, but infighting and indecisiveness within the Federal ranks allowed Lee time to gather his forces, and the Confederates earned another victory. Again, this pattern repeats itself over and over and over again in all these major battles. And while all these battles were victories for the Army of Northern Virginia, the fact that Lee had to very quickly amass his forces, he still got to pick where the battle happened, but the fact that he had to amass all of his forces very quickly and respond quickly to the Army of the Potomac, or the Army of Virginia as it was at Second Bull Run, it caused far greater losses than what would have been necessary otherwise, because Lee oftentimes had to go on the offensive. Now, Fredericksburg's kind of the lone standout here. However, even at Fredericksburg, the Confederate Army was nearly broken by George Meade's assault. Meade almost rent the Confederate Army in two, but because no one on the Union side came to support Meade when he sent back requesting support for his assault, the Army of Northern Virginia was again able to get by with what seemed like a resounding victory because of what had happened at Marye's Heights and the Stone Wall. And so that gets you to another point that I'm not going to try to draw out too much because it's not really about Lee, but it is important when understanding the opposition that he faced, was that, Second Bull Run is kind of the standout, the lone example and the standout here, in that was just kind of screw up from top to bottom, because they allowed Jackson to capture the supply depots at Centerville, and then became so focused on Jackson that they missed the rest of Lee's army coming at them, and that's how Lee was able to get victory. But at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the Union side showed a good deal of tactical and strategic competence in those battles. And so the problem wasn't really the quality of the Northern generals. Burnside and Hooker both had very good plans in those battles, and they were able to really outmaneuver Lee quite badly. But, a good plan is worthless if it doesn't have good execution. And so at Fredericksburg, Burnside's crossing of the Rappahannock was slowed by the fact that Halleck dragged his feet in getting the pontoon bridges to the site the day that they should have been there, which was the day before the main battle took place. And so that slowed Burnside's advance. Now, he still shouldn't have ordered the attack, but Burnside's initial plan was quite good. It would have dislodged Lee from the strongest position in Northern Virginia. But there was a lot of infighting within the Federal Army. The funny thing about how the war was conducted on the Federal side is that they put who they perceived to be all of their best career officers in the East, a lot of their most outstanding individuals. And unfortunately, these guys all had a lot of ego, and they were all very concerned with their own performance in battle, their own glory, and how the papers would talk about them. And so that caused a lot of infighting in the Federal Army. And then at Chancellorsville, kind of the same story. Hooker's maneuver was brilliant, completely faked Lee out of his position again, but the discord within the Federal Army prevented them from taking any advantage of that. And again, Lee would have been completely tricked out of the strongest position in Northern Virginia. And meanwhile, the Federals put all of their guys who did not quite fit in the West. And of course, the Union Army had a lot more success in the West with Grant and with Sherman and with George Thomas. But I feel like in some ways that's because these guys were a little less concerned about the career aspects of being officers and were more interested in doing things that would produce the best results. So, it's not a controversial take to say that Lee was lucky with his opponents in that first year, his one truly good year. That's a part of almost every historical narrative that revolves around the Civil War. But I think it goes a little bit too far to say that the Union officers were raging incompetence and that Lee was brilliant. Lee was, as I said, oftentimes caught out of position. He was oftentimes surprised by the Federal Army, and that caused more casualties than were necessary. But even during these darkest times in the Eastern Theater, the Federal Army displayed a lot of competence. It was the personalities, it was the infighting, it was the egos that killed them. And while Lee would certainly take an advantage to outflank his enemy if it was provided, on the whole, Lee was not very tactically innovative, even by the standards of his own time. If you look at his battles, a lot of time it's frontal assault, frontal assault, frontal assault. Frontal assaults, particularly during the Civil War, were extremely costly. 9 out of 10 of them failed, but it was the tactic that Lee tended to prefer in his battles. On the second day of Gettysburg, Lee did attempt what is known as an en-echelon assault. That's where you release your soldiers in waves from one end to the other. But en-echelon assaults were a well-known military tactic by that point. It was a tactic that originally had been pioneered by Napoleon, and so had been in the public consciousness, in the military consciousness for 60 years by that time. And so most commanders knew that if an enemy released part of their force, then what they were trying to do was they were trying to get you to overcommit to the initial wave of soldiers, so that way you wouldn't have any reinforcements that were left to commit the final attack. And so Hancock and Meade basically read right through it, and they understood that there were additional assaults that were coming in the center of the Union line, which was really Lee's objective on all 3 days of the battle, was to break the Federal center. So there's just very little evidence out there that Lee was very inventive with his tactical thinking, and his lack of innovation ended up getting a lot of his men killed unnecessarily, even when they carried the battlefield. But just to recap before we move on, the big takeaway from this segment is that there was a major deficiency in terms of how the Confederate command, including Lee himself, viewed the war strategically, and Lee was very much a part of that problem. He kind of failed to understand the strength of the strategic position in Northern Virginia and what its benefits were, and how beneficial it would have been to have honestly fought maybe not a completely static defense, but more of a defense in depth, use the terrain of Northern Virginia to their advantage to restrict the Federal Army's movements. And then also failing to understand how this terrain also, in a lot of ways, restricted the Army of Northern Virginia's capabilities as well, and their ability to move and maneuver as they would have liked to get that one big victory in the East. Now let's talk a little bit about Lee's leadership and his overall personality. Now, I'm not going to conduct some sort of deep historical psychoanalysis here, but in Emory Thomas's book about Robert E. Lee, which is otherwise total hagiography, one thing that Thomas points out is that Lee had a very difficult relationship with both of his father figures, both his real father and his wife's father, George Washington Parke Custis. Won't say much more about that other than to say that you can derive a lot about the effects on someone's personality from having to deal with that type of situation. Now you go a little bit further from that, and you can see that a number of biographers and other people who have delved into Lee's personality have come to the conclusion that he was in a lot of ways a remarkably conventional thinker for his time. He was not remotely outside the box at all. If you look at his career and his social life, he had a very strong tendency to make all of the right moves for people who were concerned about respectability. You compare this to Grant and Sherman, and other figures, Longstreet, who frequently made personal and career choices that actually ended up hurting them, but did tend to show a sort of outside the box thinking, or at the very least, they understood that there were things that were more important than always looking good, more important than being all things to all people. And if you look at a lot of the choices that Lee tended to make in his life, they seem to have been more choices that were intended to keep people from getting angry at him than they were choices that were intended to make him stand out from everybody else. Something that tends to come up, especially with a lot of lost causers and people who want to defend the South and defend Lee, is that he seems to have voiced some trepidation about slavery during his life. He was an active participant in colonization societies. Colonization was this sort of alternative to the type of emancipation and integration politics that the radical Republicans favored, or any type of more free setup. It was essentially a movement that wanted to gradually manumit enslaved individuals and then send them to Liberia or Haiti or someplace like that. Not unlike Thomas Jefferson and a lot of figures in the South at that time, Lee only ever expressed concern about the effects of slavery on white people and didn't really seem to think it was all that negative for the people who were actually enslaved. He said that the discipline that enslaved people had received was going to be crucial in colonizing them, and kind of did the white man's burden thing of saying how unfortunate it was that white people had to deal with the consequences of this. He looked down on enslaved people. He did not care about them at all. When Lee's father-in-law did pass away, he had put it as a provision in his will that all of the enslaved people who he kept as property should be freed within 5 years of the period of time that he passed away. And this was 1857, and so a number of people who support lost cause theories or whatever will say that, well, I mean, Lee would have freed them, he just didn't have time to do so. But that's completely ignoring the fact that these types of provisions in wills and in contracts were extremely common in the South, going all the way back to the time of Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, they were frequently maneuvered around in order to keep people enslaved. It was all for posterity. It wasn't to actually produce a result. And at the time that the Civil War broke out, Lee was already working to exercise other provisions in the will that would have allowed him to maneuver around this manumission provision in order to retire some of the debts of the estate. And then, of course, Lee had also voted in the 1860 election for John C. Breckinridge, who was literally the most pro-slavery candidate that Lee could have voted for in that race. Douglas and Bell were both much more moderate on the slave question. Breckinridge was the most pro-slavery candidate, and Lee had voted for the most pro-slavery candidate. And so what we really have with Lee is a mix of contradictory positions and statements that clash with his real actions, which is all perfectly in conformity with the accepted opinion of his day. This was not unusual at all. This is what a lot of people in the South were doing at the time, because this was seen as the most socially acceptable route, and as I said, it set you up to look good in the eyes of posterity while not really changing anything. And getting back to something I brought up earlier, if you want to think about how much being a slave owner in a slave-owning society impacted Lee's actions and his thoughts, why did Robert E. Lee deploy his army so far north up into Virginia? Well, I can't prove it, but something tells me that a lot of it had to do with the fact that Robert E. Lee was a Northern Virginian slaveholder. All of his close friends were Northern Virginian slaveholders, and so in the aftermath of the Union's contraband laws, he was acting to protect the interests of Northern Virginian slaveholders. So the reason that I bring all that up is not just to drag Lee through the mud, but I think it's important when understanding his leadership and his generalship, that type of background, the type of man that Lee was in society and had been in his career up until the beginning of the Civil War. And so I think if we're going to move forward in talking about Lee, then we are going to have to talk about James Longstreet. Longstreet was probably, of all of Lee's generals, the person who had the closest relationship to Robert E. Lee in terms of both working together and also in terms of personal relationship. Although there was some distance there, even on the personal front, but it's probably the person you work most closely with, other than his adjutants. Longstreet is also the single largest target of the ire of lost causers and was immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War. He was targeted by Jubal Early and by a number of Lee's former adjutants right away as essentially being the number one cause to blame for all of Lee's failures. Much of this ire against Longstreet is not only because Longstreet is a convenient scapegoat, since he was, at least after the death of Jackson especially, sort of recognized as kind of the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and was the pivotal person in a number of these battles where they all claimed that Lee should have been able to secure Southern independence. But also, Longstreet, after the war, aligned himself with radical Republicans. He aligned himself with Reconstructionists. It goes pretty far to say that Longstreet was an abolitionist prior to the end of the war, but he did certainly align himself with those causes after the war, and there may have been some personal gain in it for him. He was involved in railroads, which required a lot of northern capital to operate, and he also became part of the patronage machine for the Republican Party. Now, it is hard to say why Lee and Longstreet developed such a close working relationship. Other than the proximity of their ranks and things like that. I'm not going to psychoanalyze it, so I'm not going to get into any of that. But we do know that, in contrast to Jackson, Longstreet ran a very informal headquarters. Smoking, drinking, gambling were all allowed, and there was a lot of fraternization between the different commanders, and again, what we know was a less formal atmosphere than Jackson's command. Jackson had a lot of very interesting and odd beliefs about things, and he tended to be very strict, and he was quite totalitarian in forcing these views on a lot of his other commanders. So it kind of goes against the image of Lee as this stoic figure set in marble, that he preferred spending time at Longstreet's headquarters, but he seems to have certainly have done that. When lost causers want to blame Longstreet for the failures of Lee's command, they look at the Peninsula Campaign, where there was all kinds of miscoordination between Lee's forces that, while the campaign was ultimately successful for them during the 7 Days battles, they never were able to spring the trap that they wanted to spring against the Union Army to take full advantage of having driven Union forces apart from one another. And Lee's forces absorbed enormous casualties during those battles. They look to Second Manassas when they say that Longstreet had delayed the attack on the Union left flank, thereby negating the opportunity that Lee had to destroy the Union Army and route them back to Washington, D.C., and possibly get that big victory that they were all hoping for. They look to Gettysburg as the most infamous example, where they claim that Longstreet both delayed the attack on the second day for no good reason, as they would state, and then they also claim that it was Longstreet's hesitancy and resistance to the strategy during Pickett's charge that cost the Confederate armies a victory at Gettysburg. The fact that anyone believes that Pickett's charge could possibly be successful just kind of goes to show the lunacy that's involved here. But I think that by creating this setup on its own, a lot of the proponents of the lost cause call attention to an interesting fact, which is that Lee and Longstreet seem to have frequent and persistent issues of communication, more so than you would expect, given the fact that Lee was spending most of his time with Longstreet. In the Peninsula Campaign, if you actually look at what really happened, Longstreet performed a lot better than a lot of the other Confederate commanders during that campaign in terms of the actions of his own part of the Confederate Army. And it was the rest of the Confederate generals who seemed to have a lot of difficulty following Lee's orders. Now, at that time, Lee and Longstreet were not working all that closely together. He was just another division commander within Lee's army. And then at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run, Lee was with Longstreet's command for the entirety of that battle. And then again, if you look at Gettysburg, Longstreet was the subordinate that Lee was spending the most time with during that battle. And so you see this pattern here, and you have to kind of ask yourself, what's up with that? If the person who is closest to Lee is having the most trouble negotiating his orders during certain circumstances, then what's going on? And the issue here is that Lee notoriously gave very vague orders to his subordinates and was often unresponsive to feedback or questions about his orders. Not even hostile questions, just questions of, what should I do about this particular circumstance, or there appears to be some enemy forces entrenched in front of us. How do I handle that? Lee was very unresponsive in those situations. And so going back again, during the Peninsula Campaign, again, Longstreet was not working as closely with Lee, but Longstreet performed rather well. But for the other portions of Lee's command, he was getting questions back from Jackson and Magruder and all of these other commanders who were telling him, look, the situation in front of me is not what you think it is. I need more instruction on what to do. Or, should I attack here instead of here because it seems like a better opportunity? Lee wasn't responding to that. At Second Bull Run, Longstreet, on the first day when his forces arrived, Lee repeatedly said, attack, attack, attack. And Longstreet said, number one, my guys just conducted a forced march and came out of a battle. We're having trouble organizing. Number two, General Lee, we don't know what's up in front of us. And it turns out that had Longstreet actually attacked on the first day, he would have run right into the Federal Fifth Corps, which was heavily entrenched in a wooded area. And Confederate casualties probably would have completely have changed the course of that battle. But because Pope was so obsessed with Jackson, he moved the Federal Fifth Corps out, which was what allowed Longstreet, by chance, to surprise attack on the second day of that battle. And then at Gettysburg, he, of course, gave the notoriously vague order to Ewell to take that hill, if practicable, when he should have said, take the hill. And these are only 3 examples of things that happened repeatedly during Lee's command. And then also at Gettysburg, you have Lee's infamous orders to Jeb Stuart. Now, even in the movie Gettysburg, a lot of this is portrayed as though it was Stuart's fault, but Lee's orders to Stuart were to go around the Federal Army, interpose himself between the Federal Army and Washington, conduct raids, break up communications, but that was about the extent of it. He wasn't given any further orders than that. And so Stuart was following the orders as they were given to him. The orders were just very vague. And then on the second day of Gettysburg, just to go back to the point about not responding to feedback, Longstreet sent messages back to Lee saying, wait, the Federal Third Corps, the guys who are in front of me, they're moving up. I don't know what's going on. Should I countermarch? What should I do here? There's no response back from Lee. During Fredericksburg, as I'd mentioned, George Meade's assault at Fredericksburg before, the day was almost lost because Lee was not very responsive to requests from his own army about what to do on their right flank. And as I'd already mentioned before, during the Peninsula Campaign, Lee was not very responsive to feedback from his generals on the conditions and situations that they saw before them. And so what all of this led to was very poor coordination within the Army of Northern Virginia while Lee was in command. Even towards the very end of the war, when he had a lot of fresh green Corps commanders that he should have been keeping more of an eye on and should have known that he needed to keep an eye on, at the Battle of North Anna, he failed to spring a trap that he had laid out for the Federal Army because he didn't coordinate properly with his forces. And so, if you were a subordinate commander under Robert E. Lee, oftentimes you just kind of had to divine what it was that Lee was expecting you to do. This isn't very good leadership. This is very poor leadership. In a corporate setting, we tend to think of people like this as being somewhat indecisive or having narcissistic tendencies. And I would say that, again, not trying to psychoanalyze anybody, but I would say that Lee kind of fits the pattern with that evaluation. Compare this to Ulysses S. Grant, who is noted for often giving orders that are simple and easy to follow, but detailed. And he also explained the reasons why he was giving those orders to his subordinates and the objectives behind the orders, and then was also responsive to feedback. Every army and campaign that was led by Grant was notable for the very well-developed high degree of cooperation and coordination there was between the different efforts. Even if you're looking at the Overland Campaign, which is held up by a lot of people as evidence for why Grant is allegedly a butcher, but going back to the map that I'd showed you before, the real area of operation that the Union Army had to work within was quite small, and so they didn't have a lot of room to maneuver around, and Grant's maneuvers during the Overland Campaign show a mastery in and of itself despite the high casualty figures. And to do that, he needed a very high degree of coordination amongst his forces, whereas, again, compared to Robert E. Lee, Lee rarely ever communicated objectives. He rarely ever talked about what his thought process was. He rarely ever discussed contingencies. And then one last point that I want to hit on here deals with the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, the end and the conclusion of the war. Now, a lot of times this whole episode is portrayed as though Lee was acknowledging a reality. He acknowledged that his forces were surrounded, that there was no way out. He took in the advice of his commanders, and with no reasonable expectation of success, he decided that he wasn't going to sacrifice his men's lives. This was no longer a cause that was worth fighting for. And yet, Lee left Richmond and he left Petersburg with the determination to fight on. They fought a couple more very bloody battles after that, and Lee seemed to have been absolutely determined after the fall of the Confederate capital and the largest industrial region of the Confederacy. After it should have been extremely apparent that there was no sense in fighting on, he left Richmond determined to continue to fight on. And something that's always left out of these History Channel documentaries or these hagiographic biographies or anything else like that, at least the ones that are more generalized and narrativized. I mean, if you're watching Civil War Chronicles or something like that, then they might mention this stuff. But the one thing that oftentimes gets left out is that Lee's son, George Washington Custis Lee, was captured at Sailor's Creek a few days before the surrender at Appomattox. So do you think maybe that was the main motivating factor behind why Lee decided to surrender? I would posit that it's possible. In the past, Lee certainly had not shown any sort of great devotion towards preserving the lives of his men. I mean, heck, at Five Forks, the Confederate soldiers were so desperate that they were biting the throats out of the Union soldiers after they ran out of ammunition. So if you're willing to put your guys through that, you're probably willing to put them through just about anything. So even that final story about Lee, sacrifice and honor and realizing that the cause was done and putting aside the cause and moving on to reconciliation with the surrender has some taint on it when you think about the fact that there was probably some personal motivation, or it happened that there was a personal motivation for Lee at that time. So in conclusion, I hope this video helps bring folks a different perspective, not just on Lee himself, but also on all of these figures who we tend to polish up and shave the warts off of and set in marvel and put out there as figures who represent some sort of unquestionable ideal of greatness, and to think about what the motivations might be for crafting those narratives of history. That's the video. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell for notifications if you like the content. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.